And if the Chief Executive wishes to stand aside, well, not wishes to stand aside, she's been instructed to stand aside, and if she doesn't wish to do that, Mr Speaker, she can go.
Who is the Prime Minister talking about, and why is he so outraged? In 2018, the then CEO of Australia Post, Christine Holgate, awarded 4 watches to senior managers as a reward for their work. In total, these watches were worth $20,000. The work being rewarded was the successful completion of a refresh deal called Bank at Post. This allowed banking transactions from 3 of the 4 big banks to be done within a post office instead of a bank branch. The Bank at Post deal was called historic for a number of reasons. It brought in massive revenues, generating almost $250 million for Australia Post. It also greatly improved the services available in regional and remote communities, and it gave post office operators a more sustainable income, allowing many to stay in business. 2 years after the watches had been given, this information came out during Senate estimates in October of 2020. And I should mention that Labor were the ones initially trying to point score on this. Here's Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching trying to get a headline.
Ms Holgate, did you reward the team who worked on the agreement?
There were a small number of senior people who'd put in an inordinate amount of work in, and they did receive an award from the chair, myself, and on behalf of the board.
And what was that award?
They got watches.
And what were the watches?
They were a Cartier watch of about a value of $3,000 each.
So how many watches did you buy?
If I recall correctly, and Gary may recall, I think it was 4 people.
You can't tell me what card this was purchased on. And you're the CFO. You can't tell me you spent $12,000 on watches, and you can't tell me which credit card you put that money on.
That's correct, Senator.
You are the Chief Financial Officer, and you can't tell me where the expenditure was put against.
I cannot, because I haven't had that question today. So Australia Post has $7.4 billion worth of expenses. We look after those expenses and take great care with those expenses.
So
Just a note, she's getting flustered because the Chief Financial Officer of Australia Post can't immediately tell her which account this particular expense from 2 years ago had come from, and has offered to provide an answer afterwards. This is despite the fact that only minutes before he had told her that he wasn't even at the organisation when this had happened. But a reaction they wanted, and a reaction they got. That same day, Scott Morrison stood up in Parliament, dialed up the theatrics, and said this.
I was appalled, it's disgraceful, and it's not on, Mr Speaker. And so immediately I spoke with the shareholding minister, the Minister of Finance, and the Minister responsible, Mr Speaker, the Minister for Communications. And from those discussions, the following actions ensued. And that was that there had to be an independent investigation done by the department, not by Australia Post, that the Chief Executive should stand aside immediately, Mr Speaker, that Chief Executive should stand aside immediately, and that, Mr Speaker, the independent investigation should look into the conduct of the board members and their governance, as well as the actions of the management and the executive. That report will come back to me and my members of my cabinet, and if, Mr Speaker, there are issues to be addressed with board members, then they will be addressed then, Mr Speaker. This all happened within an hour, Mr Speaker. So appalled and shocked was I by that behaviour because, Mr Speaker, as any shareholder would in a company raise their outrage if they had seen that conduct by a chief executive, a management or a board, Mr Speaker, they would insist rightly on the same thing. Now, we are the shareholders of Australia Post, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Australian people. So that action was immediate. That action was immediate. And if the Chief Executive wishes to stand aside, well, not wishes to stand aside, she's been instructed to stand aside. And if she doesn't wish to do that, Mr Speaker, she can go.
Forget rampant corruption. Forget the billions of dollars of misspending. What makes Scott Morrison outraged is Australia Post spending $20,000 on rewards for a historic deal completed. Remember that Australia Post is what's called a government business enterprise. Basically, it's run like a private company with the government as its shareholder, and it makes a profit for the taxpayer. The government demanded that the Australia Post board stand Christine Holgate aside, and a number of days later, after intense pressure, she resigned from her position entirely. The government started an investigation using the law firm Maddox, and when the findings were released, it found no wrongdoing by Christine Holgate. There is no indication of dishonesty, fraud, corruption, or intentional misuse of Australia Post funds by any individual involved in the matters relating to the purchase and gifting of the Cartier watches. This report cost taxpayers $350,000. It's worth pausing and quickly comparing the gifting of these watches to bonuses given by Australia Post and other similar entities. The same year the watches were given, Australia Post executives were getting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bonuses. In fact, that same year, government entities paid out over $76 million in bonuses, but no outrage from Scott Morrison there. It's also worth noting that the CEO before Christine Holgate was getting paid up to $10 million a year, many times greater than what she was getting paid. Now, I'm not here to judge whether these bonuses are reasonable. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's a valid discussion, separate to what went on here. Fake outrage over watches to make it look like you're taking a stand against the wastage of public money is laughable. Christine Holgate, who from all accounts was a highly respected leader, was forced to resign for doing her job. It's interesting then how this same Prime Minister can turn around and apply a totally different standard when it suits him.
I think she'd be great. I think, as I've said before, the way that Gladys Berejiklian has been treated over these events, I think has been shameful. I've been very clear about that. What I found is that Gladys was put in a position of actually having to stand down, and there was no findings of anything. Now, I don't call that justice. She chose to resign. I don't call that justice at all. What I saw is a pile-on, and you know we're all pretty used to pile-ons on our side of politics. I see them all the time. We've got thick skins. We know how to deal with it, and Gladys certainly knows how to. She's a person I've always found to be of great integrity, and if she wants to have a crack at Warringah for the Liberal Party, I suspect the people in Warringah would welcome that.
Putting aside that he's continually attacking an anti-corruption body for doing his job, does he not see the hypocrisy here? He demanded Christine Holgate stand aside with no findings of anything against her and started one of the biggest pile-ons we've seen. And to the comment that there are no findings against Gladys, that's because the investigation is still ongoing. And who's that in the background? Is it Susan Lee? The same Susan Lee that charged taxpayers thousands of dollars for flights and other expenses to go to the Gold Coast to inspect and buy investment properties, or when she used public money to pay for flights for her and a partner to attend New Year's Eve events. I wish Scott Morrison's outrage applied equally to government ministers misspending taxpayer money. 10 seconds on Google gets you numerous examples, but this next one tells you why that outrage isn't there. In December 2019, Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg spent $5,000 of taxpayers' money to go to a Murdoch Christmas party while Australia's worst bushfires were burning. Going back to Australia Post though, there is a separate point to be made here. Before this all happened, the government tasked a consulting firm to do a review of Australia Post. The final report was completed and given to the government in early 2020 at a cost of $1.32 million. But the report wasn't made public and the government refused to release it. The Senate, though, got a hold of a summary of some of the key pieces of advice from the report. Things like reducing the speed and frequency of letter deliveries, closing at least 106 Australia Post outlets, and exploring the privatisation of the parcel delivery service. Apparently, it's fine for the Australian public to pay over $1 million for a report that we will not see, which recommends cutting the services we rely on. The political and media pressure had an intense mental impact on Christine Holgate. A few days after Scott Morrison's rant in Parliament, she sent a text message at 1:31 a.m. to a designated contact at Australia Post while she was stood aside. She wrote, "I am so low, I have sent you an email." In the email she wrote, "I'm absolutely shattered. I cannot sleep. I have those pains in my chest. I do not want to live like this. Please, will you help me?" But I don't think Scott Morrison cared. The same week that all this was happening, the government was desperate for a distraction from the Leppington Triangle scandal, where $30 million of taxpayer money was used to buy land worth only $3 million. That's another video entirely. I can't even graph a comparison between the wastage of $20,000 and $27 million, because it's on a completely different scale. And yet, where was the outrage? And only days ago in Parliament, Simon Birmingham, the most senior Liberal in the Senate, stood up and without any irony told Senator Rex Patrick off for calling out senior officials within the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet for their efforts in undermining transparency. I made a series of videos on that topic specifically, and I'll put a link in the description.
That's two senior officials have now sought to ignore the ruling of a federal court justice. Some might think it's unconventional that I come into this chamber and start naming public officials, but there are conventions being broken inside government that are far more harmful in respect of damage to institutions. The Secretary of PM&C is a cover-up expert. If there is some dark secret that the government needs to bury, Gaetjens is the man who's got the shovel.
We have just seen a most extraordinary display by Senator Patrick impugning motives against senior officials in the Australian Public Service. Members of this place, members of the other place, have respected the work of the Australian Public Service and not sought to create this type of politicised attack on individuals within it.
It is typical hypocrisy when you consider that Christine Holgate was brought directly into public debate by the Prime Minister through pretend outrage and shown no respect at all.
She can go.
I guess these calls for respect only apply when it suits them. So what happened in the end? In August 2021, it was revealed that Christine Holgate would get a payout of $1 million from Australia Post because of how they handled her termination. She would also have $100,000 of her legal fees covered. She then went on to be appointed as the CEO of a direct competitor of Australia Post. Including the $350,000 government review that found no wrongdoing, the government cost taxpayers almost $1.5 million to push out a competent CEO, all over a few watches. There's just one word for all of this: hypocrisy.